All right, hopefully this is recording correctly, but thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce our presentation, Parents and Teachers, Collateral Benefits for Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder. With us is Dr. Brian Boyd from the University of Kansas. He's going to serve as our discussant today. Our presenters include Dr. Gazi Azad from Columbia University, Dr. Sarah Dababnah from University of Maryland, Dr. Ainsley Losh from University of California, and also Dr. Yasamin Bolourian, also from University of California. You know, I recall more than 25 years ago in my graduate school course on collaboration and teaming in the schools, a guest speaker that we had, Dr. Sandra Christensen, and she held up this sign that said 90%. And that's how much time children spend at home and in the community, aside from school. And this really left an indelible impression on me of the importance of tapping into the strengths of families, empowering them to be the best advocate possible for their children, and collaborating with them as equal partners who know their children best, have their own priorities and preferences for their children, and can provide critical information on the social validity of the goals that we set, the interventions we develop, and the interventions we implement with children with disabilities in our public schools. So we have 4 papers that are going to address aspects of parent and teacher interaction that have positive collateral effects on children. Our first is Dr. Azad, who's going to describe the Partners in School model that involves parents and teachers working more effectively with each other. Next, we have Dr. Dababnah, who will start us with a presentation on parent-to-parent program called Parents Taking Action to Help Urban, Low-Income, Black Parents Understand Autism Spectrum Disorder and to better prepare them and their children for school. Third, we're going to have Dr. Losh, who will present a paper that examines whether parent-teacher relationships impact student-teacher relationships. And then we're going to conclude with our final paper from Dr. Bolourian. She's going to talk about an intervention called Smooth Sailing for improving teacher-student relationships. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dababnah.
All right, I'm going to get us started here. And as Lisa mentioned, my name is Gazi Azad, and I am an assistant professor at Columbia University. And I'm here to talk about Partners in School, which is an implementation package that I developed. And it's really to optimize parent-teacher communication and collaboration for students with autism. So I'd like to start by talking about what I term as the dual implementation challenge. And it's really, appropriate for this panel. We know that there are evidence-based practices that are available for children with autism spectrum disorder, but really their wide-scale adoption, implementation, and sustainability in real-world settings has been quite challenging, right? So that is the first implementation challenge we have. We have these EBPs, but we can't get them into the hands of parents, teachers, clinicians, who need them on the daily basis. And even if we can get them, to the hands of teachers, for example, oftentimes there's sort of fragmented implementation in one setting, right, in schools, and it rarely aligns with implementation in another setting. For example, what parents are doing at home. And so what ends up happening is this sort of discontinuity or misalignment, right, across settings. And this lack of continuity or misalignment between implementation of EBPs in homes and in schools can really have devastating impacts on the mental health outcomes, of children with autism, particularly autism, because these children really do struggle with change, and insist on rigidity. And so, if things are happening that are different across contexts, it can be really challenging for their behavioral regulation and the generalization of skills. And so I developed this Partners in School model to address this sort of dual implementation challenge. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but I'll tell you sort of the big picture. When we do this is an implementation package. So it has multiple implementation strategies and they're at multiple levels. And so here you see that we start with a targeted meeting with school administration before we sit down with parents and teachers. When we work with parents and teachers, there's a pre-consultation phone interview. This phone interview is to really figure out what are the main main concerns at home? What are the main concerns at school? We also get some more background information, such as what is reinforcing. We get a little bit of baseline data. Then the parent, teacher, and the consultant sit down and have a face-to-face meeting. The goal of that meeting is to hone in on what is the mutual concern across home and school. Oftentimes it's behavior challenges. A lot of times it's language, for children with autism. Then we figure out, a setting that's very similar at home, very similar at school. For example, transitioning from, preferred to non-preferred activities at a specific time of the day. Then we figure out what the intervention is going to be. It's the same intervention across home and school, same materials, same strategies, same language that parents and teachers are using. We provide parents and teacher with all the materials. Then the student, there's an active implementation stage where parents are doing their strategy for 3 weeks. Teachers are doing the same strategy for 3 weeks at home. It's the exact same strategy with the exact same materials. We collect a little bit of information, fidelity information to make sure parents and teachers are doing their strategies. And then there's a follow-up to get some post-consultation data and talk about some of the outcomes and maintenance strategies. What I found was I've had the opportunity to partner with Philadelphia Public Schools and then Baltimore City Public Schools to develop this model. And one of the things that I learned when I was rolling this out was that parents and teachers were becoming very dependent, on me as the consultant. And principals would always ask me, so, what happens when you leave, right? Where's the sustainability? And so that really got me thinking, I really want parents and teachers to be able to communicate effectively on their own. And so I decided that, adding a communication piece would be really important after the pre-consultation, but before the consultation meeting. And so the thought is sort of, parent-teacher communication really is essential, in order for parents to address mutual concerns and implement the same strategies across settings. And my hypothesis is that this communication is really the mechanism of change, right? If you can get parents to communicate, right, very effectively, right, we can get them to hone in on the mutual concerns and implement the same strategies. But there's actually very little known about, what communication skills parents and teachers need to successfully work together. And so I drew from a long history of sort of health communication research between patients and physicians, and I'm working to actively translate that to parent and teacher communication. So for this small exploratory study, we have 36 parents. A majority of them were mothers, about 35 years old. About half were Black, half were white, or 40%. We had some American Indian, Asian populations. About 50% of the families reported having a college degree or above, and about 40% had an income greater than 60K. We had 21 teachers teachers worked with reported on more than one parent in their classroom, which is why there are fewer teachers. They were all female, about 35 years old, about 85% white, 14% Black, and 4.8% Asian. Teachers reported teaching about 8.1 years and about 6 years teaching students with autism. The measures that we use, the communication skill use form and the communication satisfaction questionnaire were translated from the health communication. And then we used other measures that are important in this area, such as problem solving and parent-teacher relationship scale, specifically the joining scale, which is the extent to which parents and teachers come together as sort of partners in this process. And so what we found is that, there are parents are reporting certain skills that are strengths for parents. And so you'll see here that 72% of the time parents are reporting that, they tell the teacher how, if they feel worried about their child's behavior. 75% of the time they're telling their teacher, about their child behavior, different ways to help manage their behavior, telling their teacher how to best work together. But there are other skills that they report never doing, right? And so this is sort of problematic, right, for parents and teachers to work together. So 27.8% of the time parents say they never set an agenda. 25% of the time they say they never talk about problems they have in sort of, managing their children at home. So there's sort of, there's definitely areas of strengths, but a lot of areas, where parents sort of missed opportunities with parents. In terms of, with parents. In terms of teachers, what we found a strength for teachers was that they really conveyed empathy and sort of legitimized concern for parents. So 86% reported doing that. But there were many areas, sort of missed opportunities or areas that teachers reported never doing. And so, if we think about teachers, 70% of the time reporting that they never checked in if the parent really understood the information, right? 25% of the time they never broke up instructions, and checked for understanding. They never, 20, almost 30% of the time, they never asked for parents' input on intervention recommendations. They never help parents sort of prioritize concerns, right? And so we wonder why sometimes parent-teacher meetings, never go well, may not go well if these sort of communication skills, are not happening. And so that tells us that, we sort of need to actively work, to train parents in these skills. And so I was also interested in seeing if, what the relationship was with these variables and satisfaction with communication. So we want parents and teachers to be satisfied. And what we found when we put, these variables into a regression model was actually the skill use did not come up, but the extent to which parents were problem solving with teachers and the extent to which they felt like they were joining in a partnership in the parent-teacher relationship scale, that was sort of predicting their satisfaction with communication. On the teacher side, it wasn't surprising that the number of years that teachers were teaching were related to their satisfaction. And here we almost see, very close to being significant that the communication skill use, the number of skills that they were reporting was related to their satisfaction. Again, a really small sample size. So if it was a larger sample size, I imagine that would have been significant. And again, this partnership variable came up. So the extent to which parents, teachers are perceiving themselves as partners, in this process is really important for their satisfaction. So, what this is telling us is that this is, a very preliminary study, but, parents and teachers, they both display communication strengths, and these skills should definitely be reinforced. But, they're sort of struggling with more advanced communication skills. So parents, summarizing, checking for understanding, talking about how to overcome their challenges to implementation. With teachers, helping parents prioritize concerns, setting an agenda, breaking up instructions, these are all important, right, for parents and teachers to work together. And we found that these dyadic characteristics, right, the extent to which parents were problem solving and having a partnership orientation was important for parent satisfaction. For teachers, the number of years they were teaching and their partnership approach, and perhaps their individual communication skills relates to, teachers' satisfaction. So, what this is telling us is that, when we're working with parents and teachers and getting them to, implement these evidence-based practices that we know work, we should not only focus on the individual communication characteristics, but also these dyadic characteristics. And thank you so much.
All right. So I'm going to talk about kind of backing it up a little bit and talking about peer-to-peer parenting support. And this is a study that we did in Baltimore with my colleagues here, Wendy Shaya, Iran Kim, and Sandy Magana. So just a little bit about, building community partnerships to better serve Black children in Baltimore. I mean, I think that we all know that there are some pretty significant delays in Black and African American children getting access to timely diagnoses and services. And we see this, even amongst middle and high income families. In terms of Baltimore, I mean, Baltimore is a majority Black city, and about 24% of the population in Baltimore, of the Black population in Baltimore, lives underneath the poverty line. So this was a collaboration with a community outreach service at the University of Maryland, and you'll see my colleague, Dr. Wendy Shaya, a little bit later. And I would love to talk to you more about Community Advisory Board, but since I don't have a lot of time, I'll just acknowledge them and say that they're terrific and they really were essential to helping us to adopt this program in Baltimore. And this was also a collaboration with the local initiative called Brown on the Spectrum. So just a little bit about Parents Taking Action. So this was a program that was originally developed by Sandy Magana and her colleagues for Latinx caregivers of kids with autism. And we adapted the 14-week program for parents of young Black children ages up until about 8 with or at risk for autism, just acknowledging that some kids just didn't have a diagnosis yet. Parent leaders, and so those are caregivers of children ages 9 and older with autism, deliver the program. And the parent leaders and the participating parent agree when and where to meet. So, could be at home on a Saturday. The pandemic really interrupted a lot of our plans. And of course, the parents did not meet anymore at home post March 2020 last year. Both the parents and the parent leaders were recruited from Baltimore neighborhoods with 20% or higher levels of child poverty. The focus of the program, in short, is just to increase autism knowledge, to improve advocacy skills, build social support, and manage child behavior. So just a little bit about our methods. So the first aim was really to engage stakeholders to adapt and implement parents taking action. And then to pilot it and identify participation barriers and facilitators. Just a little bit about the first aim. So our advisory board was really involved in helping us to adapt the program. And so we took the whole manual and we just went through the whole thing and we talked about different ways to adapt it for the Baltimore context. We made a lot of changes. We modified the first part of the program to begin with a story of an individual with autism in Baltimore. We added lots of photos of Black children and families and reorganized it to present more information on child-directed play earlier on in the program. We recorded new video narrations. The advisory board felt strongly we should have more resources on police interactions, which we added. And of course, we revised the manual with Baltimore specific resources. So this is just a little snippet of what the manual look like. So this was the first page in the first session of the manual is a young self-advocate named Malcolm. So his story is the first one featured in the manual. And then this is my colleague, Dr. Wendy Shaya, who, in addition to being my collaborator on with the program, is also a parent of a young adult with autism. So the delivery of the program was very challenging, partly because of COVID, but even pre-COVID was challenging. 3 parent leaders deliver the program to 7 caregivers, and all of the parents also receive case management from a clinical social worker or an intern. All of the caregivers were Black mothers, and mostly had a high school education or less, and about roughly half were unemployed or had incomes under $35,000 a year. So cancellations and missed appointments were really common. About 41% of the time, caregivers canceled or missed appointments, and only 3 of the parents completed all the 14 sessions. I don't think I have time to go through all of the reasons, but I'll try to talk about them briefly. So sometimes there are disappointments that came up that were prioritized and the parents needed to attend. Lots of caregiver health issues arose, some routine, some really significant, in some cases life-threatening medical conditions. Moving and housing instability were really common. Busy work schedules, school closures, and then the lack of reliable transportation, which really extended their time doing, errands or other things that made them late or missed a meeting. COVID related shutdowns really exacerbated barriers that already existed. We did start to add financial incentives, but they didn't really help. In terms of what helped parents, parents really liked and cited parents delivering the program, and they saw them as mentors. And so one of the parents said, doctors can give all the exams, they can give all the things they want to based on what they study, but if they don't even have a child with autism, they can't really tell you and actually give you the whole 100%. They can give you 50, but they can't give you the whole 100 because they haven't actually dealt with an autistic child daily. Other parents talked in terms of facilitators talked about, you know, just having that check-in. And so when we were able to deliver services in home, you know, that often revealed and allowed us to address, you know, some basic needs like food insecurity. One of the parents talked about the check-ins that she had with her parent leader, saying we normally try to maintain life by ourselves. So I mean, even when we didn't have a meeting, my parent leader would reach out. Sometimes we just need that little question. And all the parents talked about the relevance of the program for their family, and some talked about it specifically, setting the focus on Black families. One of the parents said, I think PTA, Parents Taking Action, was relevant because a lot of times in the African-American communities, the disparities, I feel like it gets pushed under the rug in this country. My parent leaders and I actually spoke about that. Not enough attention is put on African-American families and what we go through. In terms of the flexibility, you know, certainly the flexibility to meet on the weekends or in other locations, like a couple of our families were experiencing homelessness or had other forms of housing instability. And so kind of being able to meet at the library or other places was really convenient, and they really liked that. One of the parents said 95% of programs won't offer times outside of typical weekday work hours. It's either you do it the time I give you because that's the time I have opening, or you can't do it at all. And that's just how it is, and that doesn't work. But the other side of that is that the mean time between sessions was 35 days, and opposed to what we hoped would be a weekly program, so the ideal of 7. Some parents really like kind of pushed back that it was necessary to meet on a weekly basis. And so one of the parents said, you know, Parents Taking Action gives us time to actually embrace it, to learn it, to fill it out and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, as a single mother doing this, it takes a lot of patience. And with patience, you need that space in between to actually be able to cooperate with the child, but to incorporate everything that you need inside. So, you know, I think the jury is out about, you know, how we can kind of create some kind of balance between, you know, giving parents that time that they need and that flexibility that they need, but also, you know, finishing the program, which is also would be great too, so we can see how well that it works. So thank you so much. You know, right now we're scaling up the program for online delivery for parents that are on autism and developmental evaluation waitlist. And so, you know, hopefully within the next year, we'll have a lot more data and information to share about this program. These are a few members of our team, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm excited to continue this conversation about the importance of parents in our students with ASD in their lives. So I'm going to be speaking about the impact of parent-teacher relationships and the quality of those relationships on student-teacher relationships. So looking at how those factors are connected for young students with ASD. So to just give a brief background here, we know that early student-teacher relationships and the quality of those relationships are really important for student success and student outcomes. So student-teacher relationship quality, or STR quality, as I'll just shorten it, has been consistently linked to later student outcomes. And that's been looked at across a lot of different domains. So students who have better relationships with their teachers tend to perform better in school. They have higher academic performance. They tend to be more academically engaged. And there also seem to be some social emotional benefits as well. So they tend to have better social emotional outcomes. But unfortunately, student-teacher relationships for students with ASD tend to be poor quality overall. And they tend to be comprised of more conflict and less closeness in the relationship. And this has been looked at in comparison to both typically developing peers as well as peers with other disabilities. And some of the factors that come into play here specifically for students with ASD are verbal language abilities, cognitive functioning, externalizing behavior problems. So there have been some studies looking at risk and protective factors, just to name a few. And now when we look at the role of parent-teacher relationships and kind of what the literature is suggesting, so as we've been talking about, these homeschool connections are really important. And so not surprisingly, parent-teacher relationships have also been associated with a lot of important student outcomes, student success. So a lot of similar areas that student-teacher relationships have been associated with, parent-teacher relationship quality has also been associated with. So academic engagement, social functioning, academic success, and previous research has also looked at connections between STR quality and parent-teacher relationship quality. So these two things do seem to be pretty connected, which I think makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, again, students with developmental disabilities are at risk for poor quality parent-teacher relationships. So students with ASD fall under that umbrella. So what we're seeing here is that students with ASD might be at risk for poor quality relationships with their teachers, so those student-teacher relationships, and their parents might be more likely to have poor quality relationships with their teachers as well. So both of those factors have been linked to school functioning and student success. So this might be a particularly vulnerable group of students with those multiple risk factors going on. So that's kind of what we wanted to look at a little bit more closely in this study. So our research question is kind of focused on looking at the connections between parent-teacher relationships and student-teacher relationships. So our question was, does PTR quality at the beginning of the school year predict later STR quality, so later quality relationship between the student and the teacher at the end of the school year, above and beyond initial STR quality and above and beyond some of those child factors that we previously talked about. And we're going to be looking at this in a sample of young students with ASD. So this sub-study was part of the larger Smooth Sailing study, which was a longitudinal project that took place over 2 years. And it was really looking at transition into early school for young students with ASD. So in this sub-study, we have 135 students with ASD. Our average age was 4, so these are pretty young kids. The majority of our participants were male, which does reflect those prevalence rates of ASD. I included the mean IQ score here as well, because we'll be looking at that as a child factor. But what I also wanted to just note is that this study really focused on kids who spent at least some time in general education settings. So it might not be fully representative of kids who maybe have co-occurring ID, for example. So just something to note. And then for our teachers, it was majority female and majority white, which does reflect kind of the current educational landscape, unfortunately. But I also just wanted to point that out. And so although the larger Smooth Sailing project took place over 2 years, we are focused here in this sub-study on 1 school year, just because we wanted to look at relationships with the same teacher. And a lot of kids switch teachers over the next school year. So time 1 occurred in the fall, and then time 2 was at the end of the year in the spring, the same school year. And so we had teachers complete the STRS, the student-teacher relationship scale, as a measure of the quality of their relationship with the target student. And we're using total score, so just a measure of overall quality of that relationship. We also had teachers complete the parent-teacher relationship scale in the fall, and we used total score as just an overall measure of that relationship quality between the parent of that target student and the teacher. And then we also did the WIPSI with the child as a measure of cognitive functioning, or IQ, and the CASTLE as a measure of spoken language ability. And those two are just some of those child factors that we know have been previously associated with STR quality. So we wanted to include them as kind of these controlling variables. So our results, we first just did bivariate Pearson correlations using STRS, that student-teacher relationship quality measure at the end of the year, as our outcome. And so what you can see here is all of these variables were significantly correlated with that outcome variable. And then when we look at the multiple regression, the model overall is significant. And what's really interesting is here, parent-teacher relationship quality in the fall, the beginning of the school year, was a significant predictor of later STR quality at the end of the school year, even when we're controlling for initial STR quality. So this predictor remains significant in the model above and beyond that initial STR quality. And what's also really interesting is spoken language ability and IQ were actually no longer significant. They weren't significant predictors in this model when we were taking into consideration parent-teacher relationship quality and initial student-teacher relationship quality. So I think that this really just speaks to the importance and the significance of those parent-teacher relationships. And so what does this really mean? So again, just to kind of recap, Parent-teacher relationship quality at the beginning of the school year was a significant predictor of later end of the school year parent-teacher relationship quality above and beyond initial STR quality and above and beyond child language abilities and IQ or cognitive functioning. So additional research is needed. This is just an initial descriptive study, but future research should really look more into parent-teacher relationships as a potential buffer against some of these risk factors that students with ASD experience in developing more negative STRs. So potentially parent-teacher relationship quality could kind of buffer that risk and help students develop more positive STRs. Again, more research is needed, but that's one thing that we would hope to explore more. And then also just looking into more specific factors that might contribute to parent-teacher relationship quality and developing more positive PTRs for this specific population. And taking that information and trying to find what can teachers do to promote more proactive, positive parent-teacher relationships for our young students with ASD. So then I just have my references here and my contact information. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ainsley, for that interesting presentation. My name is Yasamin Bolourian, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow on the IAS-funded smooth sailing study. Building on findings from our Goal 1 study, some of which Ainsley just shared, Smooth Sailing Goal 2 is a 4-year multi-phase project designed to develop and pilot a teacher-directed intervention, specifically for general education teachers who have students with autism. Oops. Pardon me, who have students with autism in their early elementary school classrooms. So the research that I'm presenting on today is from the Year 1 development phase, which consisted of focus groups with teachers in order to gain an in-depth understanding of their perceptions about autism and of the everyday practices that they use in the classroom. So our program builds on the premise that early student-teacher relationships, or STRs, are foundational to concurrent and later student outcomes. For example, strong STRs have been associated with higher academic achievement, self-regulation, and social confidence. And yet children with autism and their teachers often experience great difficulty establishing these positive relationships. In fact, our previous studies and others have found that compared to teachers of students with intellectual disability or typical development, teachers of students with autism often report higher conflict and less closeness in their relationships. And these teacher ratings of STRs can be largely accounted for by child behavior problems, social skills, and autism severity. Prevalent features and associated behaviors of autism contribute not only to poor STRs, but also to higher levels of teacher stress and lower levels of teaching efficacy. Indeed, many general education teachers report feeling ill-equipped to effectively teach and positively interact with these students. Thus, the inclusion of students with autism may feel daunting for general education teachers who have to adapt their usual practices to meet these students' unique needs, often without sufficient support or training. Notably, a large body of research suggests that professional development training in autism shows promise for enhancing teacher perceptions and self-efficacy. So this brings us to the iterative development of smooth sailing, the overall goals of which are to help increase teachers' autism knowledge, enhance their skills for supporting students with autism in inclusive environments, and to build more positive relationships with their students. In the present study, as part of the development phase, we invited teachers in Southern California and Massachusetts to participate in focus groups in order to gain an understanding of applicable information and strategies that other teachers would find feasible and useful to learn about in an autism training. 18 general education teachers were recruited to participate. At the onset of focus groups, participants completed a demographic survey, the results of which are shown here. The sample was majority female and mostly white. 3 participants identified as Asian or Asian American, 1 as Black or African American, and 1 as multiracial. 13 teachers had at least a master's degree. Teachers reported 1 to 41 years of teaching experience with an average of about 15 years. All teachers taught at public schools and had about 24 students in their classrooms. Teachers also reported having 3 students with individualized education programs, or IEPs, per class. Lastly, 5 teachers had previously received some form of training in autism. Our focus group design was derived and adapted from Cohen and Miguel 2018 and Grinker et al 2015. So for each prompt, participants engage in a series of guided steps, including free listing, ranking, and explanation of rankings. In the free listing step, teachers were asked to write down words or word phrases on 5 individual note cards or more if desired. Once finished, all the cards were collected and shuffled and displayed on a table. In the ranking step, participants were asked to review the displayed cards and individually rank the top 5 cards from the entire collection in order of importance, one being the most important to them. And that's what you see teachers doing here in this photo. Lastly, teachers were asked to explain the rationale for the rankings aloud. And here are also the 3 prompts. In the first, we asked, think about the students with autism who have been in your classroom. What words or phrases come to mind when you think about them? The second asked, in what ways have you effectively included students with autism in your classrooms? And finally, can you identify and describe any strategies that have been particularly effective in developing relationships with these students? In terms of analyses, we obtained a total of 280 individual responses or response cards across the 3 prompts. 2 coders were responsible for reviewing these and identifying any words or phrases that were synonymous and then putting those into groups. So for example, difficult peer interactions and social difficulties were 2 similar responses from prompt 1 that were grouped into one category labeled difficulty with social interactions. And after this coding process, we had 86 response categories. For each of these categories, we then calculated saliency scores, which allowed us to statistically rank them by perceived importance and frequency. So higher saliency scores indicated higher importance and greater consensus across participants. In the next few slides, I'll highlight the 5 most salient responses for each prompt, as well as some of the lower scored responses to emphasize possible areas of focus for future trainings. So the prompt on perceptions of autism yielded 29 response categories with saliency scores ranging from 1.89 to 0.05. Overall, the highest saliency terms listed here reflected teachers' understanding of common social and behavioral traits of autism, such as sensory sensitivities, difficulty with social interactions, and focused or fixed interests. We also saw that the positive attributes didn't seem to come to mind for teachers right away. Of the 29 response categories, only 6 responses were clearly positive, such as lovable, charming, and intelligent. And in looking at their saliency scores, we can see that these responses were given much lower rankings among participants. The second prompt regarding effective strategies for inclusion also yielded 29 response categories with saliency scores ranging from 1.56 to 0.06. Of the top responses shown here, job responsibilities was endorsed as the most salient. Teachers expressed the strategy as a way to build a sense of student ownership and active participation in the classroom community. During focus groups, teachers provided some specific examples of these, such as taking down chairs in the morning and passing out papers. And this was discussed as particularly effective when all students are assigned a job. Also, the prompt elicited responses about parent-teacher relationships, which we heard about earlier. Though these were comparatively less prominent, suggesting that teachers may not necessarily view family-school partnerships as addressing inclusion. Also, strategies that address changes to the physical classroom environment and movement or exercise were also not very salient, despite how relatively easy and effective these strategies can be to implement. The final prompt surrounding strategies that promote positive STRs yielded 28 response categories. Taking an interest in student interests had a saliency score substantially higher than that of the other categories, both within and across prompts. During focus groups, teachers talked about making time to learn about their students' interests, as well as sharing more about themselves. Anecdotally, though, I would say that this was the most challenging of the 3 prompts for teachers to respond to. If we look at some of the lower ranked responses on the right of the slide, these are perhaps a bit more specific than the higher ranked ones on the left. They tap into the how. So for example, how can I have one-on-one time with my student? I could initiate conversation or play on the playground. So these findings suggest that teachers could perhaps benefit from learning explicit ways to implement these broader, more salient student-teacher relationship building strategies with their students. So we recognize that we may have a unique sample of teachers who volunteered for the study and who may be more aware of these autism-related topics. However, findings provide useful classroom-based information that can be utilized in the development and modification of teacher training programs. One takeaway for PD programs is that some of the endorsed strategies may not have been specific to students with autism in their effectiveness. And although this is advantageous in that the strategies may be universally beneficial, they may require additional adaptations to be effective for this population. So for example, students with autism may have difficulty sharing interests, or they might focus on a singular topic. And this can make engaging in student interests more challenging for their teachers. These findings corroborate the literature in that PD programs are needed to provide teachers with specialized support on autism. So thank you to all the participating teachers for their time, to our colleagues and students on this multi-site team, not all of whom are listed here, and to the IES for funding this work. I have my contact information up here if anyone has additional questions about this presentation. We will be recruiting for the pilot study in the next few months, which will take place in the fall. So our project's email address is also provided. Thank you for your time.
So I'm Brian Boyd, and I have the privilege of being the discussant for today's presentations. It's hard to summarize such important and compelling research, but I'll attempt to do it. I think I'll start by making some general takeaway points or messages, and then discuss maybe one or two talking points for each paper. So I'll share my screen as well, and hopefully this all works itself out. So I think the first sort of general takeaway message, or what I noticed, is just how diverse some of the samples were. Just the racial, ethnic, and or socioeconomic diversity that we're seeing. And that's such an important and positive step for the field. You know, I'm hoping we really get to a place where we won't even need to use the word underrepresented within autism research, because most of our study samples will really reflect the broader population. The second sort of broad takeaway point is really the use and increased recognition and importance of community-based participatory research methods to really ensure the voices and experiences of relevant stakeholders are being reflected in our research. Another takeaway point is that parent involvement is key. We know a lot of this from research on typically developing children, that parent involvement is a predictor of positive child outcomes. And so now within the context of autism, we need more strategies to think about how we build positive relationships and interactions, both between parents and children, but also between parents and school providers or other kinds of providers. And then the last thing is that communication has to be bidirectional, right? In particular, if we want to support communication across contexts and systems, such as homes or schools, then we need to make sure there's a platform, a method of doing so. Just a few points for each of the papers. One of the things I noticed in the first paper here is that really for optimal collaboration to occur between parents and teachers, then it must start with effective communication. And yes, they have different communication skills and strengths, but we have to understand how they're communicating. And that's the way we sort of build or get towards mutual and shared decision-making models. And that's what we really want. We want parents and teachers to be on the same page, to implement interventions across contexts, but we have to understand how they're communicating. But the second paper, what I noticed is that the continued need for cultural adaptations, but that our cultural adaptations must reflect not only the challenges that that particular cultural group is facing, but also it should reflect their strengths. And one way we can really do that is by incorporating the voices and experiences of people from that marginalized community within our process. Incorporate them as we develop and modify our interventions, incorporate them as interventionists, right? We learn about strengths by focusing on and by listening to people from those communities. And this is one way we can empower families, we can empower parents, we can empower people from underrepresented groups through these cultural adaptations. But the other thing that's really important is that for some marginalized groups, structural inequalities and long-standing issues around racial inequity in society can't be ignored. That there are challenges that they face that may affect how often they can show up to intervention sessions. And those things have to be reflected in our work, and we can no longer ignore those issues in the field. It's one point, but it's an important point from this third paper: parent-teacher relationship quality within the context of students with autism matters. Again, this is work we know from research on typically developing children, that parent-teacher relationship quality, student-teacher relationship quality are both related to child outcomes. And this work is deserving of more attention within the context of autism research. How do we promote better interactions between parents and teachers and really get people on the same page? Because those relationships matter. They matter for student outcomes. And for the last paper on smooth sailing, I just think we focus too little really on general education teachers. We want our students to really be served in a least restrictive environment. For a lot of our students, that is the general education setting, but we don't provide enough supports for general education teachers to be successful at including students with autism, and we need to do more. They're asking for our help, they're asking for our support, so we need to do more if we want our students to be included. And just the last takeaway point, I think with all of these studies, what I'm hearing as we are learning more about places we need more interventions, perhaps around promoting parent-teacher relationship or promoting communication, or places where we're doing intervention, to get general education teachers on the same page or to culturally adapt interventions. I think the need for implementation science is only going to grow. We have to understand what supports we need in place to really allow parents and providers to adopt, uptake, and sustain some of these interventions in order to really make a difference. So I am so glad to have heard from this group of panelists. It was wonderful to be able to be the discussant today. And I thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing and that I hope you continue to do.
Well, thank you, Dr. Boyd. That was a wonderful summary of the presentations. And I really appreciate all the presenters and the important work that you're doing. I'm going to really look forward to your future research and how you continue to address the unmet needs and really bringing parents in as our partners in the work that we do. If you have any questions, feel free to contact those questions or direct those questions to the presenters. They all had their emails available. And thank you all very much.